The hum was the first sound of my day and the last of my night, a deep, resonant, golden vibration that seeped up from the earth and into the bones of our old farmhouse. It was the sound of industry, of perfect, mindless purpose. My husband, Eli, was a fourth-generation apiarist, a keeper of bees. His love was as steady and methodical as his work, patient, protective, focused on the health of the whole. Our life on the 40-acre lavender farm in the shadow of the Oregon Cascades was a beautiful, buzzing equilibrium. I was Maya, the beekeeper's wife, and my domain was the drying barn, the distillery, the online shop where we sold small, exquisite batches of lavender honey and soap. Our love was a well-managed hive, productive, sweet, and predictable. I mistook the profound, humming peace for the entirety of happiness. I had forgotten that peace is not the same as joy. It is merely the absence of war. My own small sting of discontent was a hidden patch of nightshade and foxglove I let grow wild behind the drying barn. Poisonous, beautiful things Eli would have ripped out had he known. They were my secret attribute to something untamed and dangerous. A whisper that not all growing things were meant to be useful or sweet. The venom entered my world on the back of a broken-down truck. A vintage Ford pickup, the color of faded rust, coughed to a stop in our gravel driveway one August afternoon, a cloud of dust and the smell of burning oil heralding its arrival. Eli was in the apiary fields, checking on the late summer honey flow. I was in the shop labeling jars. The man who climbed out looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts of a harder life. He was tall, lean, with sun-bleached hair tied back, and a face that seemed carved by wind and neglect rather than time. A fresh, angry scar ran from his temple to his jawline. He moved with a slight, favored limp. His name was Kieran, he said, his voice a low rasp. He was a wildlife photographer, or had been. His truck had given up the ghost a mile back. He needed a phone, a tow. I led him to the house phone in the kitchen. He smelled of dust, gasoline, and something else. Something feral and green like crushed pine needles. As he called a garage in town, his eyes a startling pale gray. The color of winter river ice didn't stay on the wall. They roamed the kitchen, taking in the bunches of drying lavender, the honey pots, the photo of Eli and me at the county fair, him holding a blue ribbon, me smiling a smile that now felt like a costume. Bees, he stated after hanging up, nodding towards the fields. And lavender, I said. They work together. Symbiosis, he said, the word a dry leaf in his mouth. Nice. Predictable. He didn't mean it as a compliment. He looked out the window towards the wild edge of our property, where the forest began its steep climb into the mountains. Out there, it's not symbiosis, it's predation, parasitism, a fight for every damn ray of sunlight. More honest if you ask me. His tow truck would be an hour. I offered him lemonade on the porch. He didn't sit. He stood at the railing, his back to me, a tense line against the pastoral view. He told me in fragments that he'd been following a wolf pack for a magazine piece in the Wallowas, a slip on a scree slope, a broken camera, a gash from a jagged branch. Got the shot, though, he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice. The alpha staring right down the lens. Like he knew. Like he was claiming my soul as part of his territory. He turned those wolf-gray eyes on me. You ever feel something look at you and just know you? Eli's bees knew him. They moved over his bare hands in a living veil, recognizing his calm, his scent. But that was a knowing of harmony. This was a knowing of confrontation. The question unsettled me. No, I said. It sounds frightening. It is, he agreed, a slow, tired smile touching his lips. That's how you know you're alive. The tow truck arrived. He left with a nod. No effusive thanks. But an hour later, as the sun bled into the hills, I walked to the wild patch behind the barn. And there, tucked into the fork of a foxglove stalk, was a small, battered business card. Kieran Vale, photographer. On the back, in a slanted hand, for the nightshade. It suits the view better than lavender. That was the first prick, the initial subtle injection of a foreign substance. I didn't throw the card away. I slipped it into the pocket of my apron, where it burned like a coal. He came back a week later, his truck supposedly fixed, to thank me properly, with a bottle of whiskey from a local distillery. Eli was in town for supplies. We drank a shot on the porch, the liquor fire in my throat. He didn't speak of beautiful things. He spoke of a bear he'd watched die of old age, picked apart by crows, of the eerie, perfect silence after a snowfall in the deep wilderness, of the brutality and the breathtaking honesty of a world without fences. His language was one of conflict and survival, a stark contrast to Eli's language of nurture and growth. I was a woman who cultivated softness and scent. He was a man who chronicled tooth and claw. The attraction wasn't despite the contrast, but because of it. He was the forest to my field, the storm to my sun. The first betrayal was a corruption of my own landscape. I began to see our farm through his eyes. The orderly rows of lavender, so beautiful to me, began to look like a monoculture, a prison of purple. The humming of the bees, once a lullaby, started to sound like the drone of a complacent, captive army. My nightly walks, which I'd always taken for solitude, now felt like the pacing of a creature in an enclosure. The second betrayal was a journey. He asked if I wanted to see something real, a hidden waterfall up in the national forest, a place not on any trail map. I told Eli I was driving to Portland for a 2-day seminar on organic small farm marketing, a lie I'd researched meticulously. His trust was as deep and unshakable as a well-rooted tree. "Bring back some of those fancy coffee beans," he'd said, kissing my forehead. The hike was a brutal, glorious struggle. It was all scrambling over moss-slick logs, fighting through thickets of salmonberry, the air growing colder and damper as we climbed. There was no path. He moved through the terrain like a native species, his bad legs seemingly forgotten. I was scratched, breathless, my city-bought hiking boots soaked. And then we broke through the trees, and the waterfall was there, a white roaring veil plunging into an emerald pool, the air thrumming with its power, thick with mist and the smell of wet stone and decay. It was savage and magnificent. It felt true. "See," he shouted over the roar. "No one planted this. No one tends it. It just is. It fights gravity every second. That's life." We swam in the freezing pool, the shock of it stealing my breath. Afterwards, shivering on a sun-warmed rock, he kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was a claiming, a collision. It tasted of cold water and whiskey and a terrifying kind of freedom. We made love on a bed of soft, damp moss, and it was nothing like the tender, familiar couplings with Eli. It was frantic, elemental, a little painful. A joining of two creatures in the wild, not a union of two hearts in a home. I felt like I was being unmade and remade into something wilder, something that belonged to the forest, not the farm. Thus began my life as a split colony. I was the queen of the lavender farm, presiding over a kingdom of sweetness and light, of hushed nights listening to Eli's steady breathing. And I was the feral thing in the woods, a temporary mate to a wandering predator, finding a perverse vitality in the sting of deception. I kept 2 ledgers. The farm ledger, harvest yields, inventory counts, orders for beeswax wraps. The secret journal hidden in a hollowed-out copy of The Lives of Bees on my shelf, fragmented, feverish entries. He says my hands are too soft for the stories they want to tell. The scar on his face is a map of a mountain that tried to kill him. The logistics were a complex, exhausting forage. I kept a forest kit in a locked toolbox in the barn's sturdy boots, tough pants, a plain black sweater. I bought a cheap, pay-as-you-go phone, a burner, he called it, and kept it switched off and buried in a bag of diatomaceous earth. I became an expert in the taxonomy of lies. Networking with other farm wives in Salem. A silent yoga retreat for stress. Scouting new locations for pop-up shops. Eli, whose world was governed by the honest rhythms of seasons and insects, accepted my new busyness. His concern was practical. "Don't drive tired, Maya, and take the truck, not the car. The brakes are better." The guilt was a slow-acting toxin. It would flood my system at moments of Eli's profound, unassuming goodness. When he spent a whole evening carefully rendering beeswax to make me a new set of candles, because he knew I loved their smell. When he quietly fixed the broken hinge on my jewelry box, a tiny heirloom from my grandmother. When he talked about our future, about maybe buying the adjoining parcel of land, about planting a meadow of wildflowers just for me, for the bees, for the grandchildren he hoped for. A legacy, he'd say, his hand warm and rough over mine. Something that lasts. His love was the constant, nurturing warmth of the hive. My betrayal was the invasive might, the foul-brewed disease working its destruction from the inside. To survive the psychic poison, I began to unconsciously introduce stress into my own hive. I'd forget to open the vents on the beehives on a hot day, risking the bees overheating. I'd play loud, discordant music in the distillery, disrupting the farm's quiet hum. I was trying to sicken the organism of our marriage, to make my own parasitic behavior seem like a symptom of a larger malaise, not its cause. Kieran's world was all beautiful, unforgiving stress. He lived on the knife edge of failure, on grants and assignment advances. He showed me photos on his laptop, not pretty landscapes, but intimate, brutal portraits. A coyote with a missing leg, surviving. A cougar's eyes luminous with alien intelligence. A forest fire's raging front. He loved me with the intense, focused hunger of a predator. But it was a love that existed only in the present tense, in the stolen moments. With him, I felt seen in a way Eli never saw me. Eli saw the wife, the partner. Kieran saw the animal, the potential for wildness. He was the photographer capturing my hidden, feral self. Eli, the master observer of insect behavior, began to notice the subtle, sickening changes in his queen. Not evidence, but symptoms. The new agitation in my movements, a restless flightiness. The distant look in my eyes when I watched the bees, as if I were plotting an escape. The unfamiliar earthy scent that sometimes clung to my clothes. Not lavender, not honey, but forest duff and cold stone. "You seem unsettled lately, Maya," he said one evening as we sat on the porch, listening to the crickets take over from the bees. His voice was gentle, probing. "Like a hive before it swarms. Is it the farm, the work, or that photographer fellow who's been around? His energy is disruptive, like a skunk at the edge of the field." He had not only identified the source, but named its effect in the language of his world. A skunk brought fear, agitation, a defensive response from the hive. It was a quiet, profound warning. The crisis was precipitated by a literal invasion. A late-season wildfire, sparked by a lightning strike deep in the Cascades, began to spread. The wind shifted, carrying a thick, apocalyptic haze of smoke into our valley. The air turned orange and tasted of ash. The bees grew agitated, confused. Eli was everywhere at once, moving hives to safer, clearer pastures, soaking the farm's perimeter, his face grim with a protector's dread. In the middle of this siege, Kieran texted, "Fire's Edge, East Ridge. It's the most alive thing you'll ever see. Come." The perverse pull of it was magnetic. While Eli fought to save our life's work, the temptation to witness its destruction was irresistible. I told him I was driving to the next valley to buy every spare water pump and hose I could find from other farmers. He barely looked up from his maps, his eyes red-rimmed from smoke and worry. "Be careful. The roads are chaos. I love you." The drive toward the fire was a descent into another world. The smoke grew thicker, the sky a lurid, bruised color. I met him at a dusty Forest Service road junction. We hiked up a ridge, the heat intensifying with every step. And then we saw it, the fire front, a rolling, roaring beast of flame a mile wide, consuming centuries-old firs with a sound like a freight train. It was terrifying, awe-inspiring, utterly apocalyptic. We watched, two small creatures on a rocky outcrop, as the world burned. "See?" he shouted over the inferno's roar, his face lit by the hellish glow. "That's truth. That's what's underneath all the pretty green. Creation through destruction." In that moment, watching the fire, I felt a wild, nihilistic alignment with him. Yes, burn it all. Let the pretty, productive lavender fields turn to ash. Let the careful hives melt. This was real. This was feeling. We made love there, on the hard, hot ground, with the world burning beside us, the air thick with embers and the end of things. It was the ultimate transgression, not just against Eli, but against life itself. a celebration of chaos over order. I returned home near dawn, stinking of smoke and sex and ashes. Eli was on the porch, a ghost in the gray light. He'd been up all night, hosing down the barn roofs. The wind had mercifully shifted again, sparing our farm, but the danger was still palpable. He saw me and his exhausted face tightened. He walked towards me, not with anger, but with the slow, careful approach of a man towards a spooked animal. He stopped a few feet away. His nostrils flared. He smelled it all the fire, yes, but under it, the scent of another man, of passion spent in the midst of ruin. "You didn't find any pumps," he stated. It wasn't a question. "No," I whispered, the lie dead before it was born. He looked past me, towards the still smoking mountains. His shoulders, usually so square and capable, slumped. "I've spent my life reading the signs," he said, his voice hollow with a fatigue deeper than physical exhaustion. "The way the bees cluster tells you about the weather. The color of the pollen tells you what's blooming. The queen's laying pattern tells you about the health of the whole hive." He finally looked at me, and his eyes held a pain so deep it seemed to swallow the morning light. "But I couldn't read the signs in my own queen. You've been preparing to swarm for months, and I was too busy tending the hive to see you'd already found a new, darker hollow." The beekeeper's metaphor was perfect, and it destroyed me. He saw my affair not as a simple betrayal, but as a fundamental biological rebellion, a failure of the colony. There was no flight left in me. The truth poured out, ash bitter and complete. Kieran, the forest, the fire, the disloyalty that spanned from a hidden business card to making love at the end of the world. I gave him the unvarnished, ugly honey of my deceit. As I spoke, I watched the light in his eyes, the steady, loving hum that was his essence, gutter and go out. I hadn't just broken a vow. I had proven that his entire philosophy, care, patience, nurture, community was helpless against the seductive call of the wild, the selfish, destructive lure of the flame. I had chosen the fire over the hive. When I finished, he turned and walked into the house. He emerged 20 minutes later with a single worn duffel bag. He took his favorite smoker, his late father's hive tool, and the photograph of us on our wedding day, standing surrounded by our families in a field of blooming lavender. "The colony can't survive with a diseased queen," he said, his voice flat, final. "The infection spreads. The honey turns sour. The brood dies. The only thing to do is to let the old queen go and hope the workers can raise a new one from what's left." He looked at the farm, the lavender rose gray with ash, the hives humming their oblivious tune. "This is your hive now, Maya. You and the poison you let in. I hope the wildness is worth the silence." He got into his old truck and drove down the gravel road, the dust rising behind him, blending with the lingering smoke until he disappeared. The aftermath was a silent, empty winter. Eli communicated only through a farmer lawyer from the next town. The divorce was a clean, practical division of assets. He let me keep the farm. He couldn't bear, the lawyer said, to live in the shell of the hive. My family, who saw Eli as the solid, earthy anchor I desperately needed, was appalled. "You had a garden, Maya," my mother cried, "and you planted a bomb in the middle of it." When the snows came, I tried to find Kieran. I went to the last town he'd mentioned. The bartender at the Lone Saloon recognized his description. "Vale? Yeah, he left. Said the fire scarred the place, made it less interesting. Heard he was heading to Alaska, to photograph glaciers calving. Something about watching things fall apart in slow motion." The wild, truthful passion I had craved was, by its nature, migratory. It fed on the new, the extreme, the dying. I had been a compelling subject for a season, the beekeeper's wife playing at being a wolf. But the wolf had moved on to a colder, harder wilderness. I am still on the farm. The lavender grows. The bees hum. But I am a poor keeper. I miss the signs of mite infestations until it's too late. I harvest the honey too early, or too late. The shop slowly languishes. The hum that once was the sound of my life now feels like the mocking drone of my isolation. I sought to trade the sweet, predictable industry of the hive for the fierce, honest sting of the wild. But I was never a wild creature. I was a domesticated one who romanticized the predator's freedom while ignoring the carcasses it leaves behind. The sting I coveted gave me a fleeting, electric proof of life, but the venom it left behind has paralyzed the heart of my world. I am the beekeeper's ex-wife, a queen without a swarm, presiding over a beautiful, silent, soulless kingdom of purple and gold, forever listening for a hum that has moved on, and starting at the shadow of every passing hawk.